everyone, we're going to look at the spinal cord and spinal nerves here. We're going to continue our discussion of the nervous system. Now, we're going to cover both brain, spinal cord, spinal nerves, and cranial nerves over the next two chapters. That is chapters 12 and 13. In your course pack, this begins on page 104. Just a reminder that the central nervous system, or CNS, includes brain and spinal cord. In this particular PowerPoint, we'll focus on the spinal cord and spinal nerves. So spinal cord is central nervous system, while spinal nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system. Let's talk about the spinal cord structure. It is an 18-inch long organ that runs from the base of the skull until it reaches about L1 or L2 vertebrae. It exits the skull through the foramen magnum, that is the hole inside the occipital bone. Around L1 or L2 is where we see the spinal cord terminate, and below that point we only see nerves, and we call that horsetail-like ending a cauda equina. So it is impossible to have a spinal cord injury below L1 or L2 since the spinal cord does not exist below that point. In this picture you can see the conus medullaris. That is the tapered tail-like ending that we expect to see for the end of the spinal cord. This is around L1 or L2, and below that point we see these horsetail-like appearance of the spinal nerves. And of course, that is all we have below, say, vertebrae L1 or L2. Let's talk about the meninges or coverings on the outside surface of both brain and spinal cord. These membranes or meninges are meant to provide protection for the brain and spinal cord. They are the same on both brain and spinal cord. The dura mater is the most superficial of the three layers, while the pia mater is the deepest of the three layers. Dura mater means tough mother. This tough, leathery outer covering is the most superficial outermost layer. The middle layer is known as the arachnoid matter. Arachnoid means spider web-like. In fact, this layer does have a subarachnoid space through which cerebrospinal fluid will circulate. This cerebrospinal fluid circulation acts as a shock absorber. It helps to maintain temperature and also helps to exchange waste products, gases, for instance, between the spinal cord and blood. The deepest of the three is called the pia mater. Technically, this translates as soft mother. This is the innermost, very delicate covering around the spinal cord. So it is the deepest of these three meninges or membranes: dura mater, arachnoid matter, and then the deepest is pia mater. Here again you can see the meninges covering the brain are the same. Dura mater here is the outermost layer. The arachnoid matter does take on a spider web-like appearance. Sometimes it's just referred to as the arachnoid, and the pia mater would be the deepest of the three layers. If you were to try and remove the pia mater, it would be like so tightly adhered to the brain itself that it would be very difficult to separate pia mater from underlying brain or spinal cord tissue. Lumbar taps involve extraction of cerebrospinal fluid from the subarachnoid space. Here you can see a needle has been very delicately inserted into the intervertebral disc and down into that subarachnoid space. The fluids that can be removed then can be examined for, say, infections. In this image, we're looking at an epidural, which would involve the placement of the needle back into that subarachnoid space once again, and then we would insert drugs into the spinal column area that may cause a pelvic block or other kinds of nerve deadening in that area. So here we're looking at the gross anatomy of the spinal nerves. These spinal nerves emerge from the spinal cord and they pass through spaces between the vertebrae known as the intervertebral foramen. So here you can see an opening through which that spinal nerve will emerge. There are in fact 31 pairs of spinal nerves that emerge from the spinal cord or below, and these spinal nerves innervate and serve everything from our neck region all the way down to our toes. Here again you can see another view of how that spinal nerve emerges through that intervertebral foramen, and of course that travels from the back side of your body around to the anterior side, and those spinal nerves meet along the midline on the front side or anterior side of your body. So imagine that. Your spinal nerves are actually giving you a bear hug from behind. They do wrap you from the back to the front. They do not cross the midline. So I make that point because if there is an inflammation along the spinal nerve, it does not hop across the midline. It has to originate here at the back part and travel from the spine toward the front. That's how those spinal nerves wrap us. Here you can see the 31 pairs of spinal nerves. They are mixed nerves, meaning that they are sensory and motor. That is different from, say, cranial nerves, which include, say, specifically sensory neurons or just motor neurons. Cranial nerves can also be mixed as well, but keep in mind that all spinal nerves are mixed nerves. They're also named by region. The first 8 are called cervical spinal nerves. The next 12 are called thoracic spinal nerves. The next 5 are called lumbar spinal nerves. Then there are 5 sacral and 1 coccygeal spinal nerve. If you keep in mind breakfast, lunch, and dinner, 8, 12, and 5, that's roughly the times of the day that a person might eat. Now, let's talk about the naming scheme here. All right, I'm going to draw out the cervical vertebrae. Okay, there's C1, C2, and so forth. So let me just take a moment to draw those out for you. Okay, we know there are 7 cervical vertebrae, but there are 8 cervical spinal nerves. That is because of this. The first pair of spinal nerves to emerge are actually these up here. They're called C1. Notice they sit above the vertebrae for which they are named. Okay, so I'm just going to draw these out all the way down. Okay, so notice all the cervical spinal nerves sit above the vertebrae for which they are named. There's C8. Okay, run out of room down there. Let's put C7 back over here. There's C7 above. There's C8 below. And right here is thoracic vertebrae number 1. Now, watch how the naming scheme changes. From thoracic vertebrae all the way down, the spinal nerves are sitting below the vertebrae for which they are named. So right here, that's going to be your transition point. Notice cervical spinal nerves sit above the vertebrae for which they're named. Thoracic all the way point down, they sit below the spinal nerves for which they are named. Okay, so when you're learning those vertebrae, you know there's 7, 12, and 5 vertebrae. 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar. However, in terms of spinal nerves, there's 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, and 5 lumbar. Here again is another look at the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. We know they are mixed because that means they contain both sensory and motor neurons inside their sheathing or housing. So let's use this picture to help us label the information that you find on the bottom of page 104, 105. Now, if you flip over to page 106, you can actually label this with me. So let's start with the dorsal root ganglion. That is this portion right here. It is probably the easiest thing to spot. It is a bulb-shaped structure on this particular root of the spinal nerve. This is the landmark that I would look for to help me differentiate the dorsal or posterior side of your picture from the anterior or ventral side of your picture. Okay, so the dorsal root ganglion is a collection of cell bodies. These collections of cell bodies are called ganglia when they're outside the central nervous system. So this is just a reminder that right through here, this is your spinal cord, part of the CNS, and from here over, these are spinal nerves, part of the PNS or peripheral nervous system. So now that you've found the dorsal root ganglion, we know that this root back here is in fact the dorsal root. And in fact, that is sensory information going into the spinal cord. Now, down here we have a ventral root. Remember, ventral and anterior mean the same thing, and this happens to be motor information. So let me give you an example. If you put your hand on a hot stove, information comes into your spinal cord by way of this root called a dorsal root. That dorsal root carries sensory information about the pain that you might be getting ready to feel into the spinal cord. If your spinal cord says that you should move your hand away from that hot stove you just placed it on, that information comes back out a ventral root. which is otherwise a motor portion of the spinal nerve. Now, let's talk about the information found on the top of page 105. When you look at the gray matter of the spinal cord, it takes on a butterfly shape. Okay, so right here inside, this is the gray matter right through here, and everything else surrounding it, all this out here, that's white matter. So let's talk about the portions of the gray matter first that are important for our conversation. There are ventral horns, there are lateral horns, and there are dorsal horns. So we know that back here, posterior is dorsal, and we know that this is the dorsal region. Okay, down here, this is anterior, otherwise known as ventral, and that is the ventral region. This piece that kind of sticks out right here, that is lateral. All right, so the dorsal horns are actually home to interneurons. Interneurons are only found in the central nervous system, and they serve as middlemen. They communicate between incoming sensory neurons and outgoing motor neurons. They're almost always involved in the conversation, but there are exceptions where they may not be involved. And there are some cases where sensory motor neurons may talk directly to motor outgoing neurons. Okay, so that takes care of back here. This is somatic sensory that's coming in. That talks to an interneuron back there. Now, there are also lateral horns here, and there are ventral horns. Notice it says VM and SM. VM stands for visceral motor, meaning that is automatic or autonomic in nature, while SM stands for somatic motor, meaning that is the somatic nervous system that controls the output. So, visceral means it is part of the autonomic nervous system that controls involuntary events, such as smooth muscles and cardiac muscles, glands, and organs. Okay, and you're talking about somatic motor. Somatic nervous system controls voluntary events such as that of our skeletal muscles. So let's talk about this. When you're talking about putting your hand on a hot stove, the information comes in by way of your sensory root, that is the dorsal root of your spinal nerve. It may stop and talk to an interneuron back there in the dorsal horn of the gray matter. Then the response may be sent back out one of these ventral horns. Those ventral horns send that information by way of this ventral root, which is carrying motor information to skeletal muscles. So let's take a moment to redraw this again using the picture that you have on page 106. We're going to label these items on that image. Okay, so where's the dorsal root ganglion? That is what I would look for first. Okay, there's your dorsal root ganglion. It is always on the dorsal side or posterior side of your image. That is the landmark that I would look for. We know that this piece here is your spinal cord. And this, of course, out here, this is part of our spinal nerve. So the spinal cord is part of your central nervous system. Your spinal nerve is part of the peripheral nervous system. Now, the dorsal root ganglion tells me that this is our dorsal root. And what information does it carry? It carries sensory information. That information always goes toward your central nervous system for processing. This root down here carries information away. This is our ventral root. And what kind of information does it carry? It carries motor information, so it always comes away from your CNS, in contrast to your sensory root, which carries information toward your CNS. So we know that this is our gray matter of our spinal cord. Back here is our white matter. And so let's focus on the horns of gray matter. We have a dorsal horn here, a lateral horn, and a ventral horn. Okay, so when information comes in, it may stop at an interneuron. Interneurons are housed here at the dorsal horn. We know that interneurons are found only in the central nervous system. They make communications between incoming sensory and outgoing motor neurons. The lateral horn here on the side, that's actually home to a visceral motor neuron. That's part of the autonomic nervous system. And so that controls motor control of, say, glands, organs, smooth muscle, or cardiac muscle. And finally, down here, the ventral horn is actually home to your somatic nervous system, motor control. What kinds of things are controlled by your somatic nervous system? That would include your skeletal muscles. Okay, so we've covered the gray matter there. This bridge here in the middle is called the gray commissure. And the hole in the middle there, that is the central canal through which cerebrospinal fluid will also circulate. Let's talk about the white matter. White matter is made of columns, gray matter is made of horns. If you think about houses may have a white column out front, that may be how you can remember this. There's a set of dorsal columns at the back. There are ventral ones here at the front. Of course, one over here as well. And then on the sides we have our lateral columns. So let's talk about the lateral columns and the dorsal and ventral columns here for just a moment. They may carry different types of information, either up toward the brain for processing, which would be sensory in nature, or perhaps back down from the brain to carry out the directions. That would be motor in nature. So if you have ascending tracts, that means it is traveling up through the spinal cord, going to the brain for processing. So ascending tracts are always sensory in nature. They always carry information to the brain. Whereas you may have descending tracts, which are motor in nature, and they carry information from your brain. Okay, so ascending tracts are in the white matter. They are in lateral columns, some in the dorsal. They take information up to your brain for processing. They are sensory in nature. Descending tracts come down from your brain. They travel down through the spinal cord. They are going to carry motor information. That's taking information to some part of your body to carry out a task. Let's look here. Can you spot the white matter? Well, this is the spinal cord. This is the gray matter here. And of course, all this would be white matter. That would be gray matter. There's the central canal. And this would be the spinal nerve coming off the side. There's that dorsal root ganglion. So here you can see all the parts labeled. You may want to take a moment, pause the video, and compare this to what you've drawn in your course pack on page 106. Gray matter is the interior portion of your spinal cord. You can see in this image it changes shape, but it's always butterfly or H-shaped as it travels down through the spinal cord. The white matter is always superficial. It does surround that gray matter on the interior. I want to make this point because in the brain it's actually reversed. In the brain there's gray matter that's superficial and the white matter is actually deep. So a little role reversal there when we get up to the brain. Here again you can see the columns of white matter. There's posterior or dorsal columns, lateral and ventral or anterior columns of white matter. Those always carry tracts known as ascending or descending tracts that come and go from the brain with information. Let's talk for a moment about these ascending tracts. I'm going to slide this so you can see all the information there. So ascending tracts are always found in white matter. They do take information up to your brain for processing. That information may be pain or temperature in nature, or that information may be muscle or joint related in nature. So let's talk about pain and temperature. You'll notice here that if you've put your hand on a hot stove, that information comes in through a sensory root or the dorsal root here, and it travels across the gray commissure, and then it hits the appropriate area of white matter in an ascending column and travels up to your brain. In fact, pain and temperature information is taken to your thalamus, which then relays that information out to the appropriate portion of your cerebrum for processing. Now, if you're talking about joint information, let's look at the picture on the right. Proprioreceptor information comes from receptors sitting in your joints and muscles. That gives us an idea of where your body parts are in space. Think about this. Can you close your eyes and still touch your nose? Probably. And that is due to the proprioceptor information that allows you to know where your arms and legs are in space. Again, this information is carried without your knowledge to your spinal cord up through these ascending tracts. And of course, that carries information to the cerebellum here. This is the back part of your brain. The cerebellum processes that information and helps you to make decisions about how to move your body. So what we're talking about are two special pathways. A spinothalamic pathway over here carries pain and temperature information, whereas this spinocerebellar pathway carries motor information, or muscle information rather, about where your joints are located in space. Notice the pain temperature route always takes us to the thalamus for a relay out to the appropriate part of your brain, whereas the spinocerebellar tract always takes us to the cerebellum. Keep in mind the name of the tract has the portion of the brain as part of the word as to where we're going with this information. So, ascending tracts, just a reminder, are always sensory. They're carrying information to the central nervous system, specifically to the brain. This color coding is not anything you need to memorize. Just appreciate that there are spinocerebellar tracts here shown on the right-hand side. They do take what type of information to your brain? Joint and muscle information. And so what specific part of your brain receives that sensory information? That would be your cerebellum. Likewise, the spinothalamic pathway also carries sensory information to your brain. Now this is a little different. This is pain and temperature information that's being carried to your brain. Here you can see the thalamus on the left. This is a relay station that sends sensory information out to the appropriate portions of your cerebrum. This relay station receives information from your ascending tracts that travel up your spinal cord and hit that thalamus with information. So pain and temperature information is then relayed out through the thalamus. If it never makes it to your cerebrum, it's because the thalamus will have stopped it from traveling any further. For instance, if you don't necessarily need to know that you've got clothes on, that information is screened here at the thalamus. The cerebellum is this piece here at the back of the brain. That, of course, is going to be interpreting information from those proprioceptors sitting in joints and muscles. Descending tracts carry information down. They are always motor in nature. That means they carry information from brain down to the spinal cord. And of course, that may travel out to muscles, so muscles can contract or glands can secrete. So here you can see information is contralateral. It travels down the spinal cord on one side, it goes across here, and that crossing over is what we call contralateral control. That information ultimately ends up traveling out the opposite side of the body to skeletal muscles. So we've always heard that the left hemisphere of the brain controls the right side of the body, and you can see exactly how that happens here in this picture. Just want to mention one interesting thing here called phantom limb pain. If someone has lost a limb, perhaps due to an accident, their brain and spinal cord are still hardwired to receive information from that limb. So sometimes people have itching or pain sensations in a leg or an arm that is no longer there. They have found a very low-tech, very easy way to convince the brain that that body part is gone, and that's through the use of a mirror. So you have to basically train the brain's neurons to accept the fact that there is no need to send information from those missing limbs. Even people born without arms and legs are still wired to receive information from those body parts. Last, I did want to mention referred pain. This is, again, interneurons in those spinothalamic pathways that cause a crisscrossing of information. What your brain receives may, in fact, feel like it's coming from different areas of your body. For instance, gallbladder is not found up here in your shoulder, but you may feel pain in that area. The heart, for instance, is not found on the left arm, but you may in fact feel pain running all the way down here to the pinky finger. Kidneys, notice, cover quite a wide area, all down in here. So this referred pain is useful for helping us figure out where a problem may occur, but in fact that is not actually where the pain is coming from. It is due to the crisscrossing of nerves and the wiring in that spinothalamic pathway. All right, so that should take you down to the bottom of page 105. We did the picture on page 106. That will be on the test, so make sure you study that image.